The New Dante's Inferno. A Journey Through Modern Hell. By T.M. Light. Description: The New Dante's Inferno, A Journey Through Modern Hell, is a powerful contemporary reinterpretation of Dante's classic Descent, revealing the hidden psychological and spiritual struggles of modern life. This thought-provoking book explores how digital distraction, comparison, consumerism, emotional numbness, isolation, deception, and spiritual emptiness form a modern inferno of the soul. Written in a poetic and reflective style, it guides readers from awareness of inner darkness toward truth, healing, and renewal. Perfect for readers interested in philosophy, spirituality, psychology, and self-discovery, this book offers a profound journey from suffering to awakening and the rediscovery of meaning in a chaotic world. Chapter Outline. Introduction: Lost in the Digital Dark Wood. Chapter 1: The Circle of Endless Distraction. Chapter 2: The Circle of Comparison. Chapter 3: The Circle of Endless Consumption. Chapter 4: The Circle of Lust Without Love. Chapter 5: The Circle of False Identity. Chapter 6: The Circle of Emotional Numbness. Chapter 7: The Circle of Isolation. Chapter 8: The Circle of Deception. Chapter 9: The Circle of Spiritual Emptiness. Chapter 10: The Ascent Begins. Conclusion: Emerging from the Inferno. Introduction: Lost in the Digital Dark Wood. There are moments in human history when people believe they are more advanced than ever before, yet feel further away from themselves than they have ever been. This is one of those moments. We live in an age where voices travel across oceans in seconds, where faces appear on glowing screens without delay, and where information is no longer scarce but overwhelming. And yet, in the middle of this constant motion, something quiet and essential seems to be slipping away. It is not simply time that we are losing, but presence. Not just attention, but depth. Not just connection, but meaning. This is the paradox of the modern condition: abundance on the surface, emptiness beneath it. Humanity has built an environment of endless stimulation, but very little stillness. We scroll, we swipe, we refresh, we respond. We chase updates as though they carry something vital, only to forget them seconds later. In the background of this activity, a subtle exhaustion grows, not always dramatic or visible but persistent. A kind of inner fatigue that does not come from physical labor, but from never being fully at rest within ourselves. To understand this condition, we might turn to an old image from Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. At the very beginning of his journey, Dante writes that he found himself in a dark forest, having lost the straight way. It is not a loud catastrophe that disorients him, but a quiet drifting. He simply wakes up one day and realizes he is no longer where he meant to be. The path that once seemed clear has disappeared, and the way forward is no longer obvious. He is surrounded by shadows, unsure how he arrived there and even more unsure of how to leave. In many ways, this is what modern life feels like: not a sudden fall into darkness, but a gradual forgetting of direction. People do not usually wake up and decide to lose themselves. Instead, it happens through small compromises, repeated distractions, and the slow replacement of reflection with reaction. The world does not demand that we abandon ourselves all at once. It simply keeps us busy enough that we forget to ask whether we are still aligned with who we are meant to be. The modern world is often described as connected, and in a technical sense that is true. We are more reachable than any generation before us. A message can cross continents instantly. A face can appear on a screen from thousands of miles away. Entire communities can form without physical presence. But beneath this web of connectivity lies a quieter truth: many people feel less understood, not more. They are surrounded by communication, but starved of real presence. Surrounded by voices, but lacking true listening. surrounded by visibility, but missing being seen. It is possible to be constantly engaged with others and still feel profoundly alone. This is not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of fragmentation, when attention is divided so often that nothing is fully experienced. Conversations are interrupted by notifications. Moments are split between what is happening and what might be happening elsewhere. Even joy is often observed through the lens of documentation rather than lived directly. The result is a subtle disconnection from the immediacy of life itself. In this sense, modern life does not always harm through obvious destruction. It often harms through dilution. Not by taking everything away at once, but by scattering attention so widely that nothing is deeply held. The soul, if we may use such a word in a secular age, does not disappear dramatically. It becomes thin, less anchored, less able to feel the weight of things. Over time, even emotions can begin to feel like passing weather rather than meaningful signals from within. This is why so many people describe a sense of restlessness that they cannot quite explain. They are not necessarily suffering in any traditional sense. Their lives may be stable, even successful by external measures. And yet there remains a feeling that something is off-center. A quiet question that does not go away: is this all there is? Or more personally, why does everything feel so full yet so empty at the same time? The digital age amplifies this paradox. It offers infinite options but weakens commitment. It provides endless information, but often reduces understanding. It encourages constant expression, but sometimes erodes reflection. In a world where everything can be seen, liked, shared, and commented upon, the inner world can begin to feel less urgent. Yet it is precisely this inner world, the space of thought, silence, and self-awareness, that gives life its depth. Without it, existence risks becoming a sequence of reactions rather than a journey of meaning. Days begin to resemble each other not because nothing happens, but because everything is consumed too quickly to leave an imprint. Experiences pass through us instead of settling within us. And when nothing settles, memory itself begins to feel shallow, as though life is happening slightly outside of us rather than within us. It is in this context that the metaphor of a modern hell becomes relevant, though not in the traditional sense of fire and punishment. There is another kind of suffering that is quieter and more difficult to name. It is the suffering of distraction without rest, of stimulation without satisfaction, of movement without direction. It is the feeling of being perpetually occupied, but rarely fulfilled. In such a state, nothing is missing in an obvious way, and yet something essential is not present. This form of disorientation does not announce itself loudly. It builds slowly in habits that seem harmless: the instinct to reach for the phone in silence, the discomfort of being alone with one's thoughts, the need to fill every pause with noise. Over time, these habits shape perception itself. Silence begins to feel uncomfortable. Stillness begins to feel empty. And yet it is precisely in silence and stillness that clarity once emerged. The question, then, is not simply how we became so digitally immersed. The deeper question is what we have quietly traded in exchange for it. What parts of ourselves have been softened, neglected, or outsourced to constant stimulation? And perhaps more importantly, can something within us still recognize this loss, even if we cannot fully name it? To ask these questions is not to reject technology or modern life. It is to recognize that progress without awareness can become its own kind of blindness. It is possible to move forward rapidly while losing sight of direction. It is possible to gain the world and still feel internally unanchored. And it is possible, even now, to begin noticing the difference between living and merely being occupied. Like Dante in the dark forest, the first step is not to immediately find the way out, but to realize that we are no longer on the path we intended to walk. Awareness itself becomes the beginning of orientation. The recognition that something feels lost is not a conclusion, it is an opening. And so the central question of this journey emerges gently but insistently. How did we arrive in this state of digital darkness? And more importantly, is it still possible to find our way back towards something like light? Not a light that eliminates complexity or removes modern life, but one that restores depth, presence, and inner clarity within it. This book begins in that question. Not with certainty, but with recognition. Not with answers, but with the willingness to see clearly what has too often been ignored. Chapter 1: The Circle of Endless Distraction. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from work, responsibility, or even struggle, but from constant stimulation without relief. It is the fatigue of a mind that is never allowed to settle, never permitted to become still enough to hear itself think. In the modern world, this condition has become so common that many people no longer recognize it as unusual. It is simply life as it is lived, fast, fragmented, and always in motion. At first glance, this endless motion can appear like vitality. A phone lights up, a message arrives, a video begins, a notification pulls attention in a new direction. There is always something happening, always something to see, always something to react to. The world has become a stream of uninterrupted input, and the individual is positioned as both consumer and participant in this flow. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent liveliness lies something more unsettling, a quiet erosion of presence. To understand this condition, it helps to imagine the mind not as a machine designed for constant input, but as a space, something closer to a room or a landscape. In its natural state, this inner space requires intervals of silence. It needs emptiness the way lungs need air. Without pauses, without moments of non-interference, perception becomes saturated. Everything begins to blur together, not because there is too little happening, but because there is too much happening at once. Modern distraction does not arrive as a single force. It arrives as a rhythm, a habit, a reflex. The hand reaches for the phone without conscious decision. The eyes drift toward a screen in moments of stillness. The mind, uncomfortable with silence, seeks something to occupy it almost immediately. Over time, this becomes so automatic that it feels natural. And yet, what is natural is not always what is healthy. Many forms of adaptation are simply responses to environments that are themselves distorted. The rise of digital technology has made distraction not only accessible, but engineered. Platforms are designed to capture attention, hold it, and then release it just long enough to pull it back again. This creates a loop that feels active but is in many ways passive. The user believes they are choosing what to engage with, yet the structure of engagement itself has already been shaped by systems optimized for retention rather than reflection. The result is a subtle shift in agency. Attention begins to be guided more than it is directed. This is where the idea of a circle becomes important. Endless distraction does not move in a straight line. It does not progress toward resolution. It loops. It returns. It repeats. A video leads to another video. A post leads to a comment thread. A notification leads to a response, which leads to another notification. The mind is carried along this cycle, often without realizing that it has been circling rather than advancing. Time passes but depth does not accumulate. What is most striking about this cycle is not its intensity but its subtlety. It does not feel like suffering in the traditional sense. In fact, it often feels pleasurable, even comforting. The mind is entertained, amused, stimulated. There is always something to occupy the space that might otherwise be filled with discomfort or silence. And yet, over time, something begins to shift. The ability to remain with a single thought weakens. The tolerance for stillness decreases. The inner world becomes more difficult to access. Stillness, once a natural part of human experience, begins to feel unfamiliar. A moment without input can feel strangely uncomfortable, as if something is missing. The absence of stimulation is interpreted not as rest, but as lack. In response, the mind reaches for something to fill the gap. This is how dependency forms, not through force, but through repeated relief from discomfort. Each time distraction is used to escape stillness, the threshold for tolerating stillness lowers a little more. This is one of the quiet tragedies of the digital age, the gradual disappearance of silence from ordinary life. Silence is no longer simply the absence of sound, it has become a condition that many actively avoid. Even in physically quiet environments, the mind often fills the space with digital noise. Music, videos, podcasts, feeds, there is rarely a moment left untouched. The external world may be calm, but the internal environment remains in motion. Without silence, self-reflection becomes difficult. Reflection requires distance. It requires the ability to step back from immediate experience and observe it without interruption. But distraction collapses that distance. It keeps consciousness on the surface of experience, never allowing it to sink deeper. Thoughts appear and disappear quickly, replaced before they can fully form. Emotions arise, but are quickly overwritten by new stimuli. Nothing has time to settle. This constant replacement of inner experience creates a particular kind of numbness. It is not that feelings disappear, but that they lose clarity. Joy becomes fleeting, sadness becomes diffuse, and even anxiety becomes background noise. Everything is felt, but nothing is fully processed. The soul, if one might use such a term for the inner life of meaning and awareness, becomes saturated but not nourished. One of the most overlooked consequences of this condition is the loss of attention as a stable faculty. Attention is not simply the act of looking or listening. It is the ability to remain with something long enough for it to reveal its depth. When attention is fragmented, reality itself becomes fragmented. The world is no longer experienced as a continuous whole, but as a series of disconnected impressions. Nothing is held long enough to become meaningful. In such a state, truth becomes harder to recognize. Not because truth disappears, but because the conditions required to perceive it are weakened. A distracted mind is constantly shifting before understanding can fully form. It encounters fragments of information, but rarely integrates them into coherent insight. As a result, opinions multiply while understanding thins. There is more knowledge available than ever before, but less comprehension of what that knowledge means. This is why distraction is not merely a lifestyle issue. It is a condition that shapes perception itself. A mind trained in constant interruption begins to interpret reality through the same pattern. It expects change, novelty, and stimulation at all times. When life does not provide these, it becomes restless. Ordinary moments feel insufficient. Stillness feels like emptiness. Silence feels like absence rather than presence. In this way, distraction does not just occupy time, it alters experience. It changes how reality is felt. A sunset is no longer simply observed, it is compared, captured, shared, and then replaced by the next stimulus. A conversation is no longer fully inhabited. Part of attention remains elsewhere, anticipating the next notification. Even rest becomes conditional, often interrupted by the impulse to check, scroll, or refresh. The deeper consequence of this pattern is not immediately visible. It is not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual thinning. The inner life loses density. Experiences become less rooted. Memories become less vivid. Days begin to resemble each other, not because they are identical, but because they are not fully lived. When nothing is deeply experienced, everything begins to feel similar in hindsight. This is the circle that defines modern distraction. It promises engagement, but delivers repetition. It offers variety, but produces uniformity of experience. It creates the sensation of movement while keeping consciousness within a confined loop. And because the loop is pleasurable, it is rarely questioned. The mind does not feel trapped, it feels entertained. This is what makes the circle so difficult to recognize. Yet even within this condition, there are moments when the cycle briefly breaks. They often appear as small gaps, a pause in conversation, a quiet morning without immediate obligation, a moment when the phone is forgotten or unavailable. In these gaps, something subtle can be noticed. At first it may feel like discomfort. The absence of stimulation can create restlessness. But if the moment is not immediately filled, something else begins to emerge, a faint sense of clarity, as if perception is slowly reassembling itself. These moments reveal something important. The mind is not inherently restless. It has simply become accustomed to restlessness. And what is learned can in time be unlearned. The ability to be still is not lost permanently, it is simply neglected. But neglect, if prolonged, becomes unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity often feels like impossibility, even when it is not. To recognize this is to begin questioning the assumption that constant stimulation is necessary for a meaningful life. It invites a deeper inquiry into what is actually required for clarity, for presence, and for truth to be perceived. Because truth, in its quietest form, does not compete for attention. It does not flash, notify, or interrupt. It requires a certain openness, a certain stillness, a certain willingness to remain with something long enough for it to reveal itself. And this is where the central message of this chapter begins to take shape. A distracted soul cannot hear truth. Not because truth is absent, but because distraction fills the space in which truth becomes audible. When attention is perpetually divided, nothing can be fully received. Life becomes a surface of passing impressions, rather than a depth of lived meaning. The circle of endless distraction is not simply a technological phenomenon. It is a lived experience, repeated daily in countless small choices. It is the decision to fill silence rather than sit within it, to escape discomfort rather than understand it, to seek novelty rather than depth. And while these choices may seem insignificant individually, together they shape the texture of consciousness itself. To step outside this circle does not require rejecting the modern world. It requires noticing it. It requires recognizing the difference between engagement and compulsion, between presence and reaction, between living and being continuously pulled. The first step is not escape but awareness, the moment when the loop is seen clearly enough that it is no longer invisible. And once seen, even briefly, the circle is never quite the same again. Chapter 2: The Circle of Comparison. There is a quieter kind of suffering that does not announce itself with pain or crisis, but with a subtle feeling of insufficiency that follows a person almost everywhere they go. It appears in ordinary moments, often without warning. It can arise while scrolling through a feed, glancing at an old friend's update, or even in the middle of a private achievement that should have felt meaningful. It is not loud but persistent. Not overwhelming in any single instance, but cumulative over time. It is the feeling of being slightly behind, slightly less, slightly not enough. This is the circle of comparison, one of the most invisible yet pervasive conditions of modern life. Unlike physical confinement, it does not restrict movement. People are free to travel, to speak, to create, to express themselves in countless ways. And yet internally, many find themselves bound by a relentless process of measuring their lives against others. It is a prison without walls, constructed not from external force but from perception itself. Comparison is not new. Human beings have always observed one another, gauging status, progress, and belonging. In earlier times, however, comparison was limited by proximity. People measured themselves against those within their immediate environment: family, neighbors, co-workers, communities. The frame was small, local, and therefore finite. Today, that frame has expanded beyond anything the human mind was originally designed to process. It now includes millions of lives, curated and displayed in real time, constantly updated, endlessly accessible. This expansion has fundamentally changed the nature of comparison. It is no longer occasional or contextual. It is continuous. A person no longer needs to seek comparison. It arrives uninvited, woven into the fabric of daily digital experience. With every scroll, every image, every short video, there is a silent invitation to evaluate oneself. Not always explicitly, but implicitly, through contrast. Someone is traveling, succeeding, transforming, achieving, celebrating. And even if rational thought recognizes the selectivity of these displays, emotional perception often responds differently. This is because comparison does not operate primarily through logic. It operates through feeling. The mind may understand that online lives are curated, edited, and framed, but the emotional system still reacts to what is seen as if it were a complete reality. A carefully chosen moment of joy from one person becomes, in another person's perception, the totality of that life. Meanwhile, their own life, with all its complexity, ambiguity, and unfiltered ordinariness, feels comparatively diminished. The result is a distorted mirror effect. People are not comparing their full reality to others' full reality. They are comparing their inner, unedited experience to external, curated highlights. It is a fundamentally unequal comparison, yet it feels emotionally valid in the moment it occurs. Over time, this creates a subtle but persistent erosion of self-perception. Life begins to feel like a ranking system that one is constantly failing to climb. One of the most significant shifts in modern culture is that identity itself has become increasingly externalized. Where identity was once formed primarily through direct experience, relationships, and internal reflection, it is now heavily influenced by how one appears within digital spaces. The self is not only lived, it is displayed, assessed, and interpreted by unseen audiences. And once identity becomes performative, comparison becomes inevitable. The performance is not always conscious. Many people do not intentionally craft false versions of themselves. Rather, they select moments that feel meaningful, presentable, or aesthetically pleasing. Yet even this selection process introduces distortion. Life becomes a series of highlights, while the quieter, less photogenic aspects fade into the background. But it is often those quieter aspects, uncertainty, repetition, boredom, struggle, that constitute the majority of lived experience. What emerges is a cultural paradox. The more people share of themselves, the less fully they are seen. Because what is shared is not the totality of being, but fragments arranged for visibility. And when everyone is presenting fragments of heightened experience, the collective effect is a distorted sense of normality. Ordinary life begins to feel insufficient, simply because it is no longer frequently represented. In this environment, comparison becomes almost unavoidable. It is embedded in design, reinforced by algorithms that prioritize attention-grabbing content, and sustained by a culture that equates visibility with value. The more visible a life appears, the more it is assumed to be successful, fulfilling, or meaningful. This creates a feedback loop in which attention is rewarded, and reward is interpreted as worth. But beneath this loop lies a deeper psychological consequence. the gradual fragmentation of self-worth. When value is measured externally, it becomes unstable. It rises and falls depending on what is seen at any given moment. A person may feel content in isolation, but a single exposure to another's perceived success can introduce doubt. Not necessarily about facts, but about adequacy. Not about what one has, but about what one is. This is where comparison becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. It does not lie outright, it simply omits context. It presents surfaces without depth, outcomes without process, achievements without struggle. And when the mind repeatedly encounters only outcomes, it begins to lose patience with process. It forgets that what is visible is often the end of a long unseen sequence of effort, failure, repetition, and uncertainty. Over time, this distortion reshapes desire itself. People no longer only want things for their intrinsic value, but for their comparative value. A goal becomes meaningful not simply because it is fulfilling, but because it appears better than what others have. Success becomes less about internal alignment and more about external validation. Even happiness, in subtle ways, begins to be measured against the happiness of others. This shift creates a fragile sense of identity. If self-worth depends on comparison, then stability becomes impossible. There will always be someone appearing more successful, more attractive, more fulfilled, more accomplished. The reference point is infinite, and therefore the measurement has no endpoint. No matter how much is achieved, there is always another level visible just beyond reach. Yet comparison is not only about others. It also distorts the relationship with oneself over time. A person begins to divide their identity into versions: who they are, who they could have been, who they should be based on what they observe elsewhere. The present self becomes insufficient by default. Instead of being experienced as a complete reality, it is judged as an incomplete stage in relation to imagined alternatives. This creates a form of internal displacement. The mind is never fully where it is. It is either looking backward with regret, or forward with anxiety, or outward with comparison. Rarely does it rest in the simple fact of being. And without rest, perception becomes unstable. Even positive experiences are quickly evaluated rather than simply lived. A moment of joy is followed by the question of whether it is enough, compared to what is seen elsewhere. In this way, comparison does not merely affect self-esteem, it alters the texture of experience itself. It introduces evaluation into moments that might otherwise have been direct. A sunset is not just seen, it is subconsciously compared to others seen online. A personal milestone is not simply felt, it is measured against what others have achieved by similar age or circumstance. Even private moments are not entirely private in perception, they are shaped by invisible standards carried in the mind. One of the most corrosive effects of this condition is the gradual erosion of authenticity. When life is constantly viewed through the lens of comparison, there is pressure not only to live, but to appear as though one is living well. This creates a split between experience and expression. People begin to curate not only their external presentation, but also their internal interpretation of events. They ask not only how do I feel, but also how will this look? Over time, this can lead to a subtle disconnection from genuine feeling. Experiences are filtered through anticipated perception. Even joy can feel incomplete if it is not recognized or validated externally. Conversely, ordinary moments can feel diminished if they are not seen as significant in comparison to others' lives. The internal compass becomes less reliable, gradually replaced by external reference points. And yet, despite its distortions, comparison often feels difficult to escape because it is intertwined with a fundamental human desire, the desire to belong, to improve, to be seen, to matter. Comparison promises a map for these desires. It suggests that by observing others, one can understand where one stands and how to move forward. But what it often delivers instead is confusion, dissatisfaction, and a sense of perpetual inadequacy. This is why the circle of comparison is not easily broken by logic alone. It is not enough to know that others are presenting curated versions of their lives. Even when this is understood intellectually, the emotional response often persists. The mind knows the image is incomplete, but the feeling of lack remains. This reveals something important about comparison. It is not primarily a problem of information, but of attention and perception. To see this more clearly, it helps to consider what is lost when comparison dominates attention. What disappears is the direct experience of one's own life. Instead of being lived from the inside, life is increasingly observed from the outside. Instead of presence, there is evaluation. Instead of participation, there is measurement. And where there is constant measurement, there is rarely peace. Yet within this condition, there are moments when the circle weakens. They often occur when attention is no longer pulled outward. In moments of solitude, or deep engagement with something meaningful, the comparison narrative temporarily fades. In those moments, identity is not being measured, it is simply being experienced. And what often becomes apparent in such moments is that the feeling of inadequacy is not inherent, but induced. It is not a permanent truth about the self, but a fluctuating perception shaped by context. This realization carries an important implication. Identity is not as fixed as comparison suggests. It is not a static ranking within a global hierarchy of lives. It is something more fluid, more internal, more experiential. But to access this understanding, attention must be withdrawn even briefly from the constant external reference points that sustain comparison. The deeper tragedy of comparison is not that it makes people feel worse about themselves, but that it distracts them from knowing themselves at all. When attention is continuously directed outward, the inner world becomes less familiar. Preferences become unclear. Values become unstable. Even desires begin to feel borrowed, rather than authentic. A person may find themselves wanting things they did not originally desire, simply because those things are widely visible and socially reinforced. This is how comparison slowly reshapes identity, without overt force. It does not erase the self, it overlays it. Layer by layer, external expectations accumulate, until it becomes difficult to distinguish what is genuinely desired from what is socially absorbed. And in this accumulation something essential is often lost, the quiet sense of being enough without reference to others. To recognize this is not to reject the existence of others, or the natural human inclination toward social awareness. It is to question the dominance of comparison as the primary mode of self-perception. It is to consider the possibility that constant measurement may not lead to clarity, but to confusion. And that identity, rather than being found in relation to others, may require moments of separation from that relational field in order to be seen clearly. At its core, comparison promises orientation but often produces disorientation. It suggests that by looking outward, one will understand oneself. But in practice, excessive outward looking often leads to forgetting what was there internally to begin with. The more attention is placed on external lives, the less distinct one's own life can feel. And so the central truth of this chapter emerges with increasing clarity. Comparison is the thief of identity. Not because it destroys identity outright, but because it replaces it with reflection. It turns lived experience into evaluation, and evaluation into dissatisfaction. It transforms the self from something to be inhabited into something to be assessed. To step outside this circle, does not require abandoning awareness of others. It requires restoring balance between outward observation and inward presence. It requires remembering that a life is not meant to be continuously measured against other lives, but to be experienced from within its own unfolding. And in that remembering, even briefly, something begins to return, a quieter sense of self that does not depend on comparison to exist. Chapter 3: The Circle of Endless Consumption. There is a moment in modern life that appears at first to be a form of freedom. It is the moment of choice. A screen filled with products. A marketplace that never closes. An endless stream of possibilities promising improvement, comfort, status, pleasure, efficiency, or transformation. The individual sits at the center of this abundance, scrolling through options that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Everything seems available. Everything seems within reach. And yet, paradoxically, something essential begins to feel further away the longer this abundance is engaged with. This is the beginning of the circle of endless consumption, a pattern not defined by need but by dissatisfaction. It is not simply about buying things. It is about the deeper psychological structure that turns desire into a perpetual state of hunger, where satisfaction is always postponed, never fully arrived at, and where every fulfillment becomes the starting point of a new lack. At the surface level, consumption appears to be one of the great engines of modern life. It drives economies, shapes industries, fuels innovation, and defines entire systems of production and exchange. It is often associated with progress, convenience, and even happiness. To consume is framed as to participate, to belong, to enjoy the fruits of modern civilization. And yet beneath this surface, there is a quieter truth that is rarely spoken directly. Consumption without reflection does not resolve desire. It amplifies it. Human desire, in its natural form, is not infinite. It arises, seeks fulfillment, and then rests. Hunger leads to eating, rest leads to recovery, curiosity leads to understanding. In such cycles, there is completion. But in the modern consumer environment, desire is no longer allowed to complete its cycle naturally. It is intercepted, extended, and redirected. As soon as one desire is temporarily satisfied, another is introduced. As soon as one object is acquired, attention is guided toward the next. This constant redirection creates a psychological condition that feels like motion but is actually stagnation. It is the sensation of always moving toward fulfillment without ever arriving. The individual is placed on a treadmill of wanting, where progress is measured not by inner satisfaction, but by continuous acquisition. And because acquisition is externally visible and socially reinforced, it becomes easy to confuse accumulation with growth. The modern world does not simply offer objects, it attaches meaning to them. Possessions are no longer just functional. They are symbolic. They are associated with identity, success, attractiveness, intelligence, belonging, and worth. A product is not just something to use, it is something that represents something about the user. In this way, consumption becomes deeply intertwined with self-perception. To acquire something is not only to own it, but to redefine oneself in relation to it. This is where the circle begins to tighten. Because once objects become tied to identity, desire becomes tied to insecurity. The individual does not simply want things, they want what those things represent. And because representation is socially constructed, it is constantly shifting. What signifies success today may feel outdated tomorrow. What signifies adequacy in one context may feel insufficient in another. As a result, the sense of enough becomes increasingly elusive. There is always another level of refinement, another upgrade, another version, another standard. The horizon of satisfaction moves further away with each step forward. And because the movement is gradual, it often feels like progress rather than displacement. The individual does not feel lost. They feel as though they are advancing towards something meaningful, even as the destination continuously recedes. This dynamic is particularly powerful because it is reinforced not only externally, but internally. The mind begins to adapt to the rhythm of acquisition. It learns to associate anticipation with excitement, and possession with temporary relief rather than lasting fulfillment. The emotional arc becomes familiar: desire, pursuit, acquisition, brief satisfaction, and then the quiet emergence of a new desire. Over time, this arc becomes the default structure of experience. In such a system, satisfaction is no longer a state to be inhabited, but a momentary interruption between desires. It is brief, fragile, and quickly replaced. The result is a life that is perpetually oriented toward the next thing, rather than grounded in what is already present. And because attention is always forward-facing, presence itself becomes diluted. One of the most subtle consequences of this condition is the erosion of appreciation. When the mind is trained to move quickly from one object of desire to the next, it loses the ability to dwell with what it already has. Even meaningful possessions, achievements, or experiences are absorbed into the background of familiarity before they can be fully integrated. What was once desired becomes ordinary almost immediately. And what is ordinary is easily overlooked. This creates a paradox: abundance without fulfillment. Never before in human history have so many material comforts been accessible to so many people, yet dissatisfaction remains widespread. This is not because abundance is inherently problematic, but because abundance without depth of engagement becomes noise. When everything is available, nothing feels particularly significant. The illusion at the heart of endless consumption is that fulfillment can be obtained externally. That by acquiring the right combination of objects, statuses, or experiences, the inner sense of lack will finally be resolved. This belief is rarely stated explicitly, but it is deeply embedded in cultural narratives. Success is often portrayed as a destination where desire ceases, where life becomes complete, where the pursuit finally ends. But lived experience rarely confirms this narrative. Instead, success often brings a different form of pressure: the need to maintain, protect, or surpass what has been achieved. New expectations emerge. New comparisons arise. The threshold of what is considered enough shifts upward. Rather than ending desire, success often reorganizes it. This is why consumption is not limited to material goods. It extends into status, recognition, visibility, and validation. In the digital age, attention itself has become a form of currency. Followers, likes, views, and engagement metrics function as symbolic possessions, each carrying implicit messages about worth and relevance. The self becomes something that is not only lived, but measured through external response. This introduces a new layer to consumption: the consumption of attention. Individuals not only consume objects, but also consume feedback about themselves. They ingest reactions, interpretations, and validations as part of their identity formation. And because this feedback is variable and unstable, it creates an ongoing cycle of checking, posting, updating, and reassessing. The psychological effect of this cycle is similar to material consumption, but more immediate. A moment of validation produces a surge of satisfaction, followed by a gradual decline, followed by renewed desire for more validation. The system is self-reinforcing. It encourages continued participation, while rarely offering lasting satisfaction. Underneath all of this lies a deeper existential question that is often avoided rather than confronted. If accumulation does not lead to fulfillment, then what does? If possession does not resolve inner emptiness, then what is the nature of that emptiness in the first place? And if success does not bring completion, then what is its true role in human life? These questions are uncomfortable because they disrupt the logic of consumption. They suggest that the problem is not simply insufficient acquisition, but the assumption that acquisition is the path to wholeness at all. And if that assumption is questioned, an entire structure of motivation begins to shift. The circle of consumption persists partly because it masks itself as progress. Each new acquisition feels like movement forward. Each upgrade feels like improvement. Each addition feels like enhancement. But movement is not the same as direction. Accumulation is not the same as fulfillment. And expansion is not the same as depth. In fact, excessive accumulation can sometimes have the opposite effect of what is intended. Rather than increasing freedom, it can increase dependence. More possessions require more maintenance, more attention, more comparison, more concern. The individual becomes subtly entangled in what they own. Time and mental energy are allocated not only to acquiring, but to managing, preserving, and optimizing. There is also a quieter emotional consequence. As external accumulation increases, internal sensitivity can begin to dull. When stimulation is constant, subtlety is lost. When novelty is frequent, depth becomes harder to access. The ability to find meaning in simple, unenhanced moments may diminish, not because meaning has disappeared, but because perception has been conditioned to seek intensity. This is one of the most profound distortions of endless consumption. It redefines what feels meaningful. It shifts value away from presence and towards stimulation. It encourages the belief that more input equals more life. But life in its most essential form is not measured by input. It is measured by depth of experience, by attention, by the capacity to be fully present within what is already here. In this light, consumption begins to reveal its double edge. It is not inherently evil or unnecessary. It provides comfort, convenience, expression, and even joy. But when it becomes the primary structure through which meaning is sought, it begins to consume the very awareness that seeks meaning. The pursuit of more gradually replaces the experience of enough. And so the central inversion of this chapter becomes visible. What we consume often ends up consuming us. Not in a literal sense of physical destruction, but in a subtle reorganization of attention, desire, and identity. The individual becomes shaped by what they constantly seek, and what they constantly seek becomes shaped by systems designed to never fully satisfy them. To step outside this circle does not require rejecting the material world or withdrawing from participation in it. It requires a shift in relationship, a movement from unconscious accumulation to conscious engagement, from automatic desire to reflective awareness, from external validation to internal grounding. This shift is not immediate, nor is it absolute. It begins in small moments of interruption. Moments when the impulse to acquire is noticed, rather than immediately acted upon. Moments when satisfaction is allowed to linger, rather than being quickly replaced. Moments when enough is recognized not as limitation, but as completion. In these moments, the cycle weakens. Not because desire disappears, but because it is no longer the sole driver of perception. Something quieter begins to emerge beneath it, the possibility that fulfillment may not be something to be acquired at all, but something to be recognized in the absence of constant wanting. And in that recognition, even if only briefly sustained, the circle of endless consumption begins to loosen its hold. Chapter 4: The Circle of Lust Without Love. There is a difference between hunger and nourishment, between impulse and intimacy, between contact and connection. Yet in the modern landscape of relationships, these distinctions have become increasingly blurred. What once belonged to the slow unfolding of trust, vulnerability, and emotional presence is now often compressed into brief encounters, rapid exchanges, and surface-level interactions that leave little trace of depth behind them. Desire remains, but something essential that once gave desire meaning has quietly faded into the background. This is the circle of lust without love, a pattern in which intimacy is pursued but not truly entered, where closeness is simulated but not sustained, and where the body is often present while the heart remains distant. It is not merely a moral condition, nor a simple critique of behavior. It is a structural shift in how human beings relate to one another, shaped by cultural, technological, and psychological forces that have redefined what it means to connect. At its core, human intimacy was never meant to be instantaneous. It was meant to unfold gradually, through shared time, mutual recognition, emotional risk, and the slow building of trust. Love, in its deeper sense, is not a momentary sensation, but a developing state of being with another person. It requires exposure, patience, and the willingness to remain present even when comfort is not guaranteed. It grows in the spaces where people are seen fully, not selectively. But in a culture shaped by speed, visibility, and instant access, the rhythm of intimacy has changed. Encounters that once required time and emotional investment can now be initiated and concluded within hours, sometimes minutes. Connection is often introduced through screens, mediated by profiles, images, and curated impressions. The first layer of interaction is no longer voice or presence, but representation. And when representation becomes the starting point, perception is already filtered before genuine encounter begins. This filtering creates a subtle distortion. People meet each other not as they are, but as they appear within carefully selected fragments. A photograph, a short message, a brief exchange becomes the foundation upon which desire forms. But these fragments, while real, are incomplete. They cannot contain the full emotional landscape of a person, yet they often stand in for it. As a result, attraction becomes accelerated, while understanding is delayed or entirely bypassed. This acceleration is one of the defining features of modern intimacy. Desire is quickly activated, quickly expressed, and quickly pursued. But because it is not grounded in depth, it often remains unstable. What begins as intensity may lack endurance. What feels like connection may not survive the transition into reality. And what feels like closeness in one moment may dissolve just as quickly in the next. In such an environment, intimacy becomes fragmented. It is no longer a continuous process of getting to know another person, but a series of moments that may or may not develop into something lasting. Each encounter carries potential, but also uncertainty. And because the structure of engagement is often temporary by default, emotional investment is frequently held at a distance, even when physical closeness is present. This is where the separation between desire and connection becomes most apparent. Desire in its raw form is immediate. It arises quickly, often without narrative or context. It is rooted in attraction, chemistry, curiosity, and physical response. Connection, however, requires time. It requires vulnerability, communication, shared experience, and emotional presence. When these two are separated, desire can operate independently of meaning. The result is a form of intimacy that is intense but hollow, expressive but unanchored. People may experience physical closeness without emotional grounding, or emotional projection without true relational depth. In many cases, what is experienced is not connection with another person, but a temporary merging of projections, expectations, and unmet needs. Modern hookup culture, in its most distilled form, reflects this separation. It is often framed as freedom, autonomy, and liberation from traditional constraints. And in some ways, it does represent a departure from older structures that were restrictive or limiting. But freedom without depth can become another kind of limitation. When intimacy is reduced primarily to physical interaction without emotional integration, something essential is left unresolved. This unresolved space often manifests later as a subtle emotional residue, a sense of emptiness that is difficult to name. Not necessarily regret, and not always sadness, but a feeling that something important was bypassed. The body may have experienced closeness, but the deeper layers of self remain untouched. And because those deeper layers are where meaning is formed, their absence becomes noticeable in quiet moments afterward. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this dynamic is the assumption that physical intimacy alone is sufficient to satisfy the deeper human need for connection. While physical expression can be meaningful and even sacred within the context of genuine relationship, it does not automatically produce emotional fulfillment. Without trust, continuity, and mutual recognition, physical interaction can become disconnected from the very meaning it is often assumed to represent. This disconnection contributes to a growing sense of emotional detachment in modern relational culture. People learn, often through repeated experience, to separate physical expression from emotional vulnerability, to engage without fully opening, to participate without fully investing, to remain partially withdrawn even in moments of apparent closeness. Over time, this becomes habitual, shaping expectations about what relationships are and how they function. Yet beneath this detachment lies a deeper contradiction. Human beings continue to long for connection that is meaningful, stable, and emotionally reciprocal. The desire for being seen, understood, and accepted does not disappear. Instead, it often coexists with patterns of engagement that make such connection more difficult to sustain. This creates a tension between longing and behavior, between what is sought and what is repeatedly enacted. It is within this tension that loneliness begins to take on a more complex form. It is no longer simply the absence of interaction, but the absence of depth within interaction. A person may be socially active, romantically engaged, or physically connected, and still feel emotionally isolated. This is because loneliness is not only about presence, it is about resonance. It is about whether one's inner world is truly met by another. In a culture where intimacy is frequently mediated by performance, this resonance becomes harder to achieve. People are often aware, consciously or unconsciously, that they are being perceived through layers of presentation. This awareness can lead to self-protection. Instead of full vulnerability, there is selective disclosure. Instead of openness, there is curated expression. And while these strategies may reduce immediate emotional risk, they also limit the possibility of deeper connection. The commodification of desire further intensifies this dynamic. In many modern contexts, attraction is shaped by visual presentation, social status, perceived desirability, and external validation metrics. Profiles, images, and curated identities function almost like markets of attention, where individuals are implicitly evaluated and compared. This creates an environment where desire can become transactional, even when no explicit transaction is intended. When desire is shaped in this way, it risks becoming detached from genuine knowing. A person may be desired for what they represent, rather than who they are in their full complexity. And conversely, individuals may present themselves in ways that maximize desirability rather than authenticity. This mutual shaping of perception creates interactions that are efficient but shallow, stimulating but unstable. Over time, this can lead to a subtle erosion of trust in intimacy itself. If experiences of connection repeatedly fail to produce lasting emotional fulfillment, the assumption may form that depth is either rare or impossible. This can lead to resignation, where individuals continue to seek connection, but with lowered expectations, or detachment, where seeking itself becomes less emotionally invested. And yet, the longing for depth remains. It does not disappear, simply because it is repeatedly unmet. Instead, it often becomes more abstract, less clearly defined but more persistent in feeling. It appears in moments of quiet reflection, in the aftermath of transient encounters, in the contrast between external activity and internal emptiness. It is the sense that something more is possible, even if it is not immediately accessible. This is where the phrase "desire without depth leaves the soul starving" becomes more than metaphor. It describes a condition in which stimulation is present, but sustenance is absent. Desire, when separated from emotional grounding, can generate intensity but not nourishment. It can produce excitement but not fulfillment. It can create movement but not meaning. The starvation in this sense is not physical, but existential. It is the depletion that occurs when experiences do not integrate into a coherent sense of self or connection. When encounters do not deepen understanding. When intimacy does not translate into belonging. The result is a subtle hunger that persists even in the presence of activity. What makes this condition particularly complex is that it is often mistaken for abundance rather than lack. Because there is access to more potential connections, more opportunities for interaction, more avenues for expression, it may appear that relational life is richer than ever before. But quantity does not necessarily translate into depth. And without depth, abundance can feel strangely empty. To move beyond this circle is not to reject desire, nor to deny physical expression, nor to idealize older relational structures without critique. It is to reconsider the relationship between desire and meaning. It is to ask whether intimacy can be more than momentary satisfaction, whether connection can be more than performance, whether closeness can include not only the body, but also the unfolding presence of two inner worlds meeting without pretense. This requires a different tempo of relating, a slowing down of perception, a willingness to remain in uncertainty rather than rushing toward resolution, a tolerance for emotional exposure that is not immediately rewarded by certainty or outcome. It requires the recognition that depth cannot be accelerated without being altered, and that what is rushed often remains incomplete. In such a shift, intimacy begins to change form. It becomes less about immediate gratification and more about gradual discovery. Less about performance and more about presence. Less about consuming an experience and more about inhabiting a relationship. And in this slower rhythm, something that was previously missing begins to become possible: continuity of meaning. This continuity is what transforms desire into something more sustaining. When desire is held within a framework of emotional connection, it does not dissipate after fulfillment. It integrates. It becomes part of a larger narrative between two people, rather than an isolated event. And in that integration, the sense of emptiness that often follows transient encounters begins to diminish. Ultimately, the circle of lust without love is not only about how people relate to each other, but about how deeply they are willing to be present within relationship at all. It is about whether intimacy is approached as consumption or as connection, as performance or as presence, as momentary escape or as shared unfolding. And within that distinction lies a quiet but profound truth. What is sought through desire is often not simply physical satisfaction, but recognition, resonance, and emotional belonging. When those dimensions are absent, desire continues, but it remains unfulfilled in a deeper sense. To recognize this is not to impose restriction, but to reopen possibility. The possibility that intimacy can be more than transaction, that desire can coexist with depth, and that connection, when allowed to unfold fully, can offer not only stimulation, but meaning that does not fade immediately after contact ends. Chapter 5: The Circle of False Identity. There is a strange experience that many people encounter in modern life, though they rarely describe it in these exact terms. It is the feeling of being slightly removed from oneself, as if life is being lived from behind a thin layer of glass. On the outside, everything appears functional. Conversations happen, responsibilities are met, roles are performed, and appearances are maintained. Yet on the inside, there is a subtle sense that something is not fully aligned, as though the person participating in life is not entirely identical with the person experiencing it. This is the beginning of the circle of false identity, a condition in which the self becomes something performed rather than inhabited, curated rather than discovered, and displayed rather than deeply known. It is not a sudden loss of identity, nor a dramatic collapse of personality. It is a gradual layering of roles, expectations, and presentations that slowly obscure the original sense of I beneath them. Over time, what remains is not absence, but fragmentation. Modern life does not demand a single identity. It demands many. A person is expected to be one version of themselves in professional environments, another in social settings, another online, and yet another in private. Each context carries its own set of expectations, behaviors, tones, and appearances. None of these roles is necessarily false in itself, but together they create a complex system of adaptation that can gradually distance a person from any stable sense of inner continuity. At first, this adaptability feels like strength. The ability to adjust, to present oneself appropriately in different environments, is often rewarded. It is associated with professionalism, social intelligence, and competence. But over time, adaptation can turn into fragmentation when the boundaries between roles become so strong that they begin to compete rather than coexist. The self is no longer experienced as a unified presence moving through different contexts, but as a collection of context-specific versions that may not fully recognize each other. Nowhere is this fragmentation more visible than in digital life. Online spaces encourage the construction of identity through selection. What is shown, what is hidden, what is emphasized, and what is omitted all contribute to a curated version of the self. Photographs are chosen not simply to reflect reality, but to present it in a specific light. Words are crafted not only to communicate, but to be perceived in a certain way. Even silence becomes meaningful, interpreted by others as signal rather than absence. In this environment, identity becomes something edited rather than lived. The self is not only expressed, it is designed. And while there is nothing inherently wrong with presentation or expression, the problem arises when the presented self begins to replace the experienced self. When the image becomes more familiar than the internal reality it is meant to represent. When recognition from others becomes more immediate than recognition of oneself. This shift creates a subtle but powerful tension. On one hand, there is the lived experience of being a human being with private thoughts, insecurities, contradictions, and emotions that do not always translate neatly into external expression. On the other hand, there is the constructed version of the self that is offered to the world, often simplified, refined, or amplified for clarity and acceptance. The distance between these two can gradually widen, until they no longer feel fully connected. What emerges from this distance is a quiet form of self-alienation. A person may begin to wonder which version of themselves is more real, the one that exists internally in moments of solitude, or the one that appears externally in social or digital spaces. Over time, this question itself can become destabilizing, not because there is a clear answer, but because the presence of multiple answers suggests fragmentation rather than unity. The pressure to maintain curated identity does not come solely from external expectations. It is also reinforced internally. Human beings naturally seek belonging, recognition, and acceptance. When certain versions of the self receive more positive reinforcement than others, there is an unconscious tendency to repeat and strengthen those versions. This is how performance begins to solidify into identity. What is rewarded externally becomes reinforced internally, even if it does not fully align with inner experience. In professional environments, this dynamic is often formalized. Individuals are expected to adopt certain tones, behaviors, and emotional expressions depending on their roles. Competence may require restraint, authority may require confidence, and collaboration may require adaptability. Over time, these expectations can become so internalized that they persist even outside the environments in which they were formed. The professional mask begins to extend beyond the workplace, shaping communication, posture, and even emotional expression in personal life. Social environments add another layer. In relationships, friendships, and casual interactions, there is often an unspoken pressure to be likable, agreeable, or interesting. This does not necessarily involve dishonesty, but it does involve selection. Certain aspects of the self are emphasized, while others are softened or withheld. Humor may be amplified, vulnerability may be limited, and uncertainty may be concealed. The goal is not deception but connection. Yet in the process, authenticity can become diluted. The cumulative effect of these adaptations is a self that is highly responsive to context, but less anchored in inner continuity. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" the more immediate question becomes, "Who do I need to be here?" This shift is subtle but profound. Identity becomes reactive, rather than foundational. It is shaped more by environment than by essence. One of the most significant consequences of this condition is the growing fear of authenticity. To be authentic is to risk misalignment with expectations, to reveal aspects of oneself that may not be immediately accepted or understood. In a culture that rewards curated presentation, authenticity can feel vulnerable, even risky. It exposes inconsistencies, uncertainties, and imperfections that curated identity often conceals. As a result, many people begin to manage authenticity rather than inhabit it. They express it selectively, in controlled environments or with trusted individuals, while maintaining more polished versions of themselves in broader contexts. Authenticity becomes something regulated, rather than spontaneous. It is no longer a continuous state, but a negotiated one. This negotiation creates internal tension. The more carefully identity is managed, the more effort is required to maintain coherence across contexts. Memory becomes a tool of consistency, remembering how one is expected to behave in each environment, how one is perceived, how one has presented oneself previously. Over time, this can create a subtle cognitive and emotional load, as the self must constantly track its own representations. In some cases, this leads to a sense of exhaustion that is difficult to trace to any single cause. It is not physical fatigue, but identity fatigue. The exhaustion of maintaining coherence across multiple versions of oneself. The strain of ensuring that what is felt internally does not conflict too visibly with what is expressed externally. The effort of sustaining performance across contexts that never fully overlap. Yet even within this condition, there is often a persistent intuition that something essential is being missed. Moments of solitude, or unstructured time, can sometimes reveal a faint sense of discontinuity. A feeling that the self experienced privately is more fluid, more uncertain, and more complex than the self presented publicly. This realization can be unsettling, but it is also revealing. It suggests that beneath the layers of performance, there is still an underlying presence that has not been fully erased. The challenge is that modern environments rarely encourage sustained engagement with this underlying presence. Instead, they encourage continuous outward orientation. Feedback loops of validation, comparison, and visibility reinforce attention toward external perception. Identity becomes increasingly shaped by how it is seen rather than how it is experienced. And when being seen becomes the primary reference point, the internal sense of self can begin to fade into the background. This is how the circle of false identity deepens. It is not that the self disappears, but that it becomes secondary to its representations. The image of the self gains priority over the felt reality of being. And because images are more easily shared, measured, and responded to, they often feel more immediate than internal experience. Over time, this can invert the natural relationship between being and appearing. One of the quiet tragedies of this inversion is that people can become strangers to themselves without realizing when the shift occurred. There is no single moment of loss, no clear boundary crossed. Instead, there is a gradual accumulation of distance. Choices made for social acceptance, adjustments made for professional success, edits made for digital presentation, all of these slowly reshape the contours of identity until the original sense of self becomes harder to locate. And yet, even in this condition, the sense of self does not vanish entirely. It remains present, though often less frequently attended to. It appears in moments when performance is not required, when expectations are temporarily suspended, when there is no immediate need to present or manage identity. In such moments, a quieter version of being can emerge, less polished, more uncertain, but also more direct. These moments reveal an important truth: authenticity is not a fixed state that is lost or retained once and for all. It is a mode of being that can be accessed, neglected, and re-engaged. It is not destroyed by performance, but it can be overshadowed by it. And what is overshadowed is not absent, it is simply less visible. To move beyond the circle of false identity is not to abandon roles, responsibilities, or social adaptation. It is to re-establish a clearer relationship between the performing self and the experiencing self. It is to recognize when adaptation serves life and when it begins to replace it. It is to allow moments where the self is not managed, but simply inhabited. This requires a form of inner honesty that is not performative. An honesty that is not concerned with how it is perceived, but with how it is experienced. It involves tolerating the discomfort of not always appearing coherent, polished, or certain. It involves accepting that identity is not a finished product to be displayed, but an unfolding process to be lived. In such a shift, the layers of false identity do not necessarily disappear, but they lose their totalizing power. They become tools rather than prisons, modes of expression rather than definitions of being. And beneath them, something quieter but more stable can be felt: the continuity of presence that does not depend on performance to exist. This continuity is what breaks the deepest illusion of the circle. The illusion that the self is only what is shown. The illusion that identity must be constantly maintained through presentation. The illusion that without performance, there is nothing left. In reality, what remains without performance is not emptiness but simplicity. Not absence but presence without adornment. And it is within that simplicity that the possibility of genuine self-connection begins to return. The greatest prison, then, is not the existence of roles or masks, but the forgetting that they are not the whole of who we are. It is becoming so identified with what is performed that what is lived internally becomes unfamiliar. It is becoming, slowly and quietly, a stranger to oneself. And yet, even a stranger can return home. Chapter 6: The Circle of Emotional Numbness. There is a kind of pain that does not scream. It does not demand attention through visible crisis or dramatic collapse. Instead, it fades the world inward. It softens colors, flattens emotion, and quiets intensity, until life itself feels slightly distant, as if experienced through a layer of glass or fog. It is not that nothing is happening, but that what is happening no longer fully reaches the place where it can be deeply felt. This is emotional numbness, and in the modern human condition it often appears not as failure, but as adaptation. It is the mind and body's attempt to protect themselves from overwhelming experience by reducing the intensity of experience itself. In this sense, numbness is not the absence of feeling, but a strategy for survival in environments where feeling too much has become too costly, too disruptive, or too painful to sustain. The circle of emotional numbness begins quietly, often long before it is recognized. It begins with small moments of avoidance. A feeling arises that is uncomfortable: sadness, grief, disappointment, loneliness, anxiety, and instead of being fully felt, it is redirected. Attention shifts. The phone is checked. A task is initiated. A distraction is introduced. The emotional wave is interrupted before it fully forms. At first, this interruption feels like relief. And in many ways, it is relief. To avoid emotional pain is to avoid distress in the immediate moment. The nervous system relaxes slightly. The mind regains a sense of control. Life continues without disruption. But what is not felt does not disappear. It is simply postponed. And what is repeatedly postponed begins to accumulate beneath the surface of awareness. Modern life provides an extraordinary number of tools for this postponement. Entertainment is constant. Communication is instant. Distraction is infinite. There is always something to watch, something to read, something to consume, something to engage with that allows emotional discomfort to be bypassed. This creates an environment where avoidance is not only possible, but effortless. And what is effortless becomes habitual. Over time, the habit of avoidance becomes a pattern of emotional regulation. Instead of moving through feelings, the mind learns to move away from them. Instead of sitting with discomfort until it resolves, it learns to replace discomfort with stimulation. Instead of allowing sadness to complete its natural cycle, it interrupts sadness with noise. This does not eliminate emotional experience, but it fragments it. What emerges from this fragmentation is a gradual thinning of emotional depth. Feelings still arise, but they do not fully settle. They appear briefly and then dissipate, replaced before they can be fully integrated. Joy becomes fleeting. Sadness becomes indistinct. Anger becomes muted. Even love can begin to feel distant, as though it is being observed rather than inhabited. This is the beginning of emotional numbness, not as a sudden state, but as a continuum. It does not arrive all at once. It builds layer by layer, each layer formed by a moment of avoidance, a moment of escape, a moment of choosing not to feel what was present. And because each individual moment feels justified, too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed, the larger pattern often goes unnoticed. One of the most significant drivers of this pattern is the modern relationship with pain. Contemporary culture often frames discomfort as something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Emotional pain, in particular, is treated as something to be fixed, managed, optimized, or avoided. There is an implicit expectation that a well-functioning life should be relatively free of sustained emotional distress. But emotional pain is not only inevitable, it is also meaningful. Grief, disappointment, fear, and sadness are not malfunctions of the human system. They are part of its depth. They indicate attachment, loss, value, and vulnerability. To feel deeply is to be affected by life. And to be affected is to be alive in a full sense of the word. When pain is consistently avoided, this depth is reduced. The system becomes efficient but shallow. It protects itself by limiting intensity. But in doing so, it also limits aliveness. The goal of avoidance is not destruction, but preservation. Yet over time, preservation without engagement leads to stagnation. Emotional life becomes less like a flowing river and more like a partially frozen surface. Suppressed grief plays a central role in this process. Grief is one of the most profound emotional experiences because it requires contact with loss. Whether that loss is of a person, a relationship, a version of oneself, or an unrealized possibility, grief demands presence. It cannot be fully processed through distraction. It requires time, stillness, and willingness to feel the weight of absence. In a culture that prioritizes forward movement and emotional efficiency, grief often becomes inconvenient. There is pressure to move on, to stay positive, to not dwell. While these phrases may be well-intentioned, they can unintentionally encourage emotional bypassing. The result is that grief is not resolved but stored. It remains within the system, unprocessed, quietly shaping perception from beneath awareness. Unprocessed grief does not always appear as sadness. It can appear as fatigue, irritability, detachment, or a general sense of disconnection from life. It can also appear as a reduced capacity for joy. When emotional space is occupied by unresolved pain, there is less room for new emotional experiences to fully take root. Life continues, but its emotional resonance is diminished. Escapism becomes the primary mechanism for managing this internal accumulation. Escapism is not always dramatic or obvious. It does not necessarily involve extreme behaviors. More often, it takes the form of subtle everyday disengagement. Constant stimulation, endless scrolling, background noise, compulsive productivity, social distraction, anything that prevents sustained contact with inner experience. Escapism is often justified as rest or relaxation, and in many cases it does provide temporary relief. But when used habitually to avoid emotional contact, it becomes something else. It becomes a barrier between the self and its own interiority. The mind becomes skilled at leaving itself whenever discomfort arises. And in doing so, it loses familiarity with its own emotional landscape. Emotional shutdown is the next stage in this progression. It occurs when the system becomes overwhelmed not by a single event, but by accumulated unprocessed experience. When emotional intensity repeatedly exceeds the capacity for integration, the mind and body adapt by reducing sensitivity. This is not a conscious decision, but a protective mechanism. In emotional shutdown, feelings are not eliminated, they are muted. The capacity to feel remains, but it is dampened. Life continues, but with reduced emotional variance. Highs are less high, lows are less low, and everything in between becomes more uniform. On the surface, this can resemble stability. But beneath it lies a kind of emotional withdrawal from full participation in life. What makes emotional numbness particularly complex is that it can initially feel like relief. After periods of emotional overwhelm, numbness can seem like peace. The absence of intense feeling can be mistaken for healing. But over time, it becomes clear that absence of pain is not the same as presence of aliveness. A life without emotional depth is not necessarily painful, but it is often quietly empty. This emptiness is difficult to articulate because it does not present itself as suffering in the traditional sense. It is not always sadness. It is not always despair. It is more like a muted distance from experience. A sense that life is happening, but not fully arriving. That events are occurring, but not fully landing. That time is passing, but not fully being inhabited. The irony of emotional numbness is that it often develops as a response to pain, yet it gradually becomes its own form of suffering. Not the sharp suffering of acute distress, but the slow suffering of disconnection. The suffering of being unable to fully feel one's own life. The suffering of being present without presence. At the core of this condition is a simple but profound truth. What we refuse to feel does not disappear. It accumulates. It waits. It shapes perception from behind the scenes. And eventually it expresses itself in indirect ways, through fatigue, disinterest, detachment, or a sense that something essential is missing without knowing exactly what that something is. This is why numbness is not the absence of emotion, but the presence of unprocessed emotion held at a distance. It is a form of containment that has exceeded its intended duration. A temporary protective state that has become a long-term condition. And like all prolonged suppression, it eventually begins to affect the whole system. To move beyond the circle of emotional numbness is not to force feeling or overwhelm the system with intensity. It is to slowly reintroduce permission. Permission to feel without immediately escaping. Permission to remain with discomfort long enough for it to unfold, rather than interrupting it prematurely. Permission to experience sadness, without treating it as failure, and joy without immediately diminishing it through distraction. This process is not immediate, and it is not linear. Emotional sensitivity returns gradually, often in waves. At first, feeling again can be uncomfortable, even destabilizing, because it reawakens capacities that have been dormant. But over time, as trust is rebuilt within the emotional system, feeling becomes less threatening and more natural. In this reawakening, something essential begins to return: depth. Not only the depth of pain, but the depth of aliveness itself. The capacity to be moved by small things. The ability to experience moments without immediately escaping them. The reemergence of emotional texture in a life that may have become too smooth, too distant, too muted. And in that return, it becomes clear that numbness was never the destination. It was a pause, a protective threshold, a temporary shield against overwhelm. But it was never meant to be permanent. What it protected was not meant to be frozen, but to be eventually felt, processed, and integrated. The circle of emotional numbness ends not with the elimination of pain, but with the restoration of emotional honesty. The willingness to let life be felt again in its full range, without excessive avoidance or premature escape. And in that willingness, something quietly profound becomes possible once more: the return of a life that is not only managed but deeply lived. Chapter 7: The Circle of Isolation. There is a peculiar silence that exists even in the loudest places. It is not the silence of absence, but the silence of disconnection. It can be felt in crowded rooms, busy streets, group conversations, and glowing screens filled with messages that arrive instantly from everywhere at once. On the surface, everything suggests connection. Voices overlap, notifications appear, conversations unfold in rapid succession, and faces are constantly visible. Yet beneath this activity, something essential is missing. The presence of others does not necessarily translate into the experience of being with others. This is the circle of isolation, one of the most paradoxical conditions of modern life. It is not the isolation of physical separation, but the isolation that emerges within proximity. It is the experience of being surrounded but not reached, visible but not seen, accessible but not truly encountered. It is a loneliness that persists not because connection is absent, but because connection lacks depth. In earlier eras, loneliness was often associated with physical solitude. A person alone in a remote place, separated from community or companionship, was understood to be isolated. In the modern world, however, this definition no longer fully applies. People can be constantly connected through digital platforms, continuously communicating, constantly exchanging messages, images, and reactions, and still experience a profound sense of emotional distance. The external structure of connection exists, but the internal experience of connection is often absent. This distinction is crucial. Connection is not simply the exchange of information. It is not the mere presence of communication channels or the frequency of interaction. True connection involves presence, attention, emotional resonance, and the sense of being understood in a way that goes beyond surface exchange. Without these elements, interaction can occur endlessly without producing the felt sense of closeness that human beings instinctively seek. Modern digital communication excels at maintaining contact, but often struggles to sustain presence. Messages are brief, rapid, and often consumed while attention is divided. Conversations are interrupted by notifications, multitasking, and shifting contexts. Even when communication is frequent, it is often fragmented. The result is a continuous stream of partial attention, rather than sustained engagement. This fragmentation creates a subtle but persistent form of relational distance. People remain in contact with one another, but rarely in full contact. They respond, react, and acknowledge, but do not always fully inhabit the interaction. Over time, this can produce a sense that relationships are occurring at the level of interface rather than presence. The interaction is real, but the depth is reduced. At the heart of this condition lies a transformation in the nature of attention. Attention, once directed toward a single person or moment, is now constantly divided. A conversation may take place while another tab is open, while a notification is anticipated, while background thoughts remain partially engaged elsewhere. This divided attention prevents full immersion in relational experience. And without immersion, emotional depth becomes difficult to sustain. Human beings are not only social in a functional sense, they are relational in a deeply emotional and psychological sense. The feeling of being connected to another person does not arise solely from proximity or communication, but from the experience of being emotionally received. It is the sense that another person is not only aware of one's presence, but is also mentally and emotionally present with it. When this experience is missing, connection can feel incomplete even if interaction is frequent. This is why loneliness in the modern world is often so confusing to those who experience it. It does not always correspond to observable conditions. A person may have friends, family, colleagues, and constant communication, and still feel deeply alone. This form of loneliness is not caused by absence of people, but by absence of resonance. It is not about being unseen in a physical sense, but about not feeling fully met in an emotional sense. One of the most significant contributors to this form of isolation is the increasing reliance on mediated interaction. Screens, while powerful tools for communication, inevitably introduce a layer between individuals. This layer is not merely technological, it is perceptual. Facial expressions are flattened into images. Vocal tone is filtered through devices. Timing is fragmented by delays and interruptions. Even when communication is synchronous, it is still mediated through a format that limits full sensory and emotional presence. This does not make digital communication meaningless. It is, in many ways, a remarkable expansion of human connectivity. But it does change the texture of interaction. It favors speed over depth, accessibility over immersion, and continuity over presence. And when these preferences become dominant, the experience of relational depth can become less frequent. Alongside this technological mediation is a cultural shift in the expression of vulnerability. In many modern contexts, vulnerability is simultaneously desired and avoided. It is admired in theory, but often feared in practice. To be vulnerable is to be exposed, and exposure carries risk. It involves revealing aspects of oneself that may not be accepted, understood, or reciprocated. As a result, many people learn to regulate vulnerability carefully, expressing it in controlled doses rather than allowing it to unfold naturally. This regulation of vulnerability creates a form of emotional distance, even within relationships that are otherwise close. People may share experiences, opinions, and even personal stories, but still withhold the deeper layers of emotional truth that create genuine intimacy. This withholding is often not intentional in a conscious sense, but protective. It is shaped by past experiences, social expectations, and the subtle pressure to maintain emotional composure. Over time, however, this protective pattern can become habitual. Relationships begin to operate within certain emotional boundaries that are rarely crossed. Conversations remain meaningful, but within limits. Support is present, but often structured. Understanding exists, but is sometimes partial. And within these boundaries, a quiet form of isolation can persist even in relationships that appear functional and stable. Another dimension of modern isolation arises from the performance of social presence. In many environments, individuals are expected not only to participate, but to present themselves in socially legible ways. This can involve maintaining a certain tone, appearance, humor, confidence, or emotional regulation depending on context. While these adaptations are often necessary for social navigation, they can also create a sense of being partially unavailable to others in an authentic sense. When interaction becomes performance-oriented, even subtly, there is a shift in internal experience. Attention is no longer fully directed toward the other person, but partially directed toward oneself as it is being perceived. The question of, "How am I being seen?" begins to accompany the interaction. This dual awareness divides attention, reducing the capacity for full relational presence. The interaction continues, but with reduced depth of immersion. This is one of the reasons why loneliness can feel particularly intense in group settings. In a crowd there is movement, noise, and activity, but not necessarily connection. The presence of many people does not guarantee emotional contact. In fact, the contrast between external stimulation and internal absence can sometimes intensify the feeling of isolation. The individual is surrounded by life, but not necessarily participating in it in a meaningful relational sense. Digital environments amplify this paradox. Social platforms create the appearance of constant social engagement. Posts are liked, commented on, shared, and viewed. People are visible to one another in ways that were previously impossible. Yet this visibility does not always translate into emotional closeness. The interaction often remains at the level of reaction rather than presence. A like is not a conversation. A view is not understanding. A comment is not necessarily connection. This creates a situation in which relational signals are abundant, but relational depth is inconsistent. The mind receives frequent indicators of social contact, but the emotional experience of being with others remains uneven. This discrepancy can contribute to confusion about the nature of loneliness itself. It becomes harder to identify what is missing when so much interaction is constantly occurring. One of the most profound aspects of this condition is that it often coexists with social activity. A person may be socially active, digitally connected, and relationally engaged in multiple contexts, yet still experience a persistent sense of being alone. This suggests that loneliness is not simply a quantitative issue, but a qualitative one. It is not about how many connections exist, but about the depth and authenticity of those connections. At its core, loneliness is the experience of disconnection from being truly seen and emotionally received. It is not merely the absence of others, but the absence of felt presence within interaction. When presence is missing, interaction becomes hollow, regardless of its frequency or scale. And when interaction becomes hollow, even abundance of contact does not resolve the underlying sense of isolation. The fear of vulnerability plays a central role in sustaining this circle. Vulnerability requires the risk of not being fully accepted. It requires the willingness to be seen without control over interpretation. In environments where social judgment is constant and comparison is implicit, this risk can feel heightened. As a result, people often protect themselves by limiting the depth of exposure in relationships. However, this protection comes at a cost. While it reduces the risk of rejection or misunderstanding, it also reduces the possibility of deep connection. Emotional distance becomes both a safeguard and a barrier. It preserves stability, but limits intimacy. Over time, this balance can shift toward isolation, even within relationships that remain outwardly intact. The paradox of modern loneliness is that it is not caused by a lack of connection opportunities, but by the conditions under which connection occurs. When interaction is fragmented, attention is divided, vulnerability is managed, and presence is partial, connection becomes structurally limited. And within these limitations, isolation can persist even in the midst of constant communication. To understand this more deeply, it is important to recognize that human beings do not only need interaction, they need attunement. Attunement is the experience of being emotionally aligned with another person in a shared moment of presence. It is not something that can be forced or manufactured through frequency of contact. It arises from attention that is undivided, receptive, and engaged. When attunement is absent, interaction can feel incomplete. It may still be pleasant, useful, or entertaining, but it does not fully satisfy the deeper need for emotional resonance. And when this lack of resonance is repeated across multiple relationships and interactions, a general sense of isolation can begin to form, even without obvious external causes. The circle of isolation is sustained by this gap between contact and connection, between visibility and presence, between interaction and attunement. It is a gap that is often invisible, precisely because interaction itself is so abundant. But abundance of contact does not guarantee depth of connection. And without depth, contact alone is not enough to dissolve loneliness. To step outside this circle is not to withdraw from society or reject modern communication. It is to reintroduce presence into interaction. It is to prioritize attention over speed, depth over frequency, and emotional honesty over performance. It is to allow moments of genuine attunement to occur, even if they are fewer, rather than relying on constant but shallow contact. In such moments, something shifts. The sense of being alone in the presence of others begins to soften. Interaction becomes less about exchange and more about experience. And within that experience, the simple but profound reality emerges: connection without presence is another form of absence. And in recognizing this, even briefly, the circle of isolation begins to loosen its grip. Chapter 8: The Circle of Deception. There is a point in every human life where truth becomes inconvenient. Not because truth itself changes, but because the cost of acknowledging it begins to feel heavier than the comfort of avoiding it. At that point, something subtle begins to happen. Reality is no longer faced directly. It is softened, adjusted, reinterpreted, and gradually reshaped until it becomes more tolerable to live within. This is the beginning of deception, not always as an act of intentional lying, but as a process of internal negotiation with discomfort. The circle of deception is not built on a single grand falsehood. It is constructed from many small ones. It is formed in the quiet spaces where awareness and avoidance meet, where a person senses something clearly but chooses not to fully acknowledge it, where perception is gently bent to preserve emotional stability. Over time, these small distortions accumulate, and what emerges is not a single lie, but a way of living that depends on selective truth. Self-deception is one of the most complex phenomena of human consciousness because it requires a split within the self. There is the part that knows, and the part that refuses to know. There is the awareness that perceives reality as it is, and the interpretation that modifies it into something easier to carry. This internal division allows a person to function without immediate collapse, but it also creates a persistent tension beneath experience. Something is always slightly unresolved, slightly misaligned, slightly avoided. At first, self-deception appears harmless. It often begins as a coping mechanism. A difficult situation arises, an uncomfortable truth surfaces, or a personal limitation becomes visible. Instead of confronting it fully, the mind adjusts the narrative. A mistake becomes a misunderstanding. A pattern becomes an exception. A responsibility becomes something external rather than internal. These adjustments are not immediately catastrophic. In fact, they often feel necessary. They preserve emotional equilibrium in moments when direct confrontation might feel overwhelming. But what begins as protection gradually becomes habit. And what becomes habit eventually becomes identity. A person no longer simply avoids certain truths. They begin to organize their worldview in ways that naturally exclude them. The mind becomes skilled at constructing explanations that preserve comfort while minimizing disruption. Over time, these explanations begin to feel like reality itself, even when they are only partial representations of it. One of the most common forms of deception is rationalization. Rationalization is the process by which behavior is justified after the fact in order to reduce internal conflict. When actions do not align with values, the mind seeks explanations that restore coherence. Instead of changing behavior, it changes interpretation. Harmful actions are reframed as necessary, unavoidable, or temporarily justified. Responsibility is diluted through context, comparison, or deflection. Rationalization is particularly powerful because it preserves self-image. Human beings have a strong need to see themselves as coherent and morally consistent. When behavior contradicts this self-image, discomfort arises. Rather than allowing this discomfort to lead to change, the mind often resolves it by adjusting the narrative. In doing so, the sense of internal conflict is reduced, but at the cost of truthfulness. Over time, repeated rationalization creates a widening gap between lived behavior and acknowledged reality. A person may continue engaging in patterns that they would not fully endorse if examined directly. Yet because each instance is individually justified, the broader pattern remains obscured. The mind does not perceive a contradiction because each moment has been independently reconciled. Alongside rationalization is denial, a more direct form of truth avoidance. Denial does not reinterpret reality, it excludes it from awareness. It is the refusal to fully acknowledge something that is already partially known. Unlike rationalization, which works by reframing, denial works by omission. Certain facts, feelings, or patterns are simply not integrated into conscious reflection. Denial is often sustained by fragmentation of attention. In a world filled with constant distraction, it becomes easier to avoid sustained engagement with uncomfortable truths. If awareness is never held in one place long enough, difficult realizations can be perpetually postponed. The mind moves quickly from one stimulus to another, preventing deeper convergence on anything that might require emotional reckoning. But what is not integrated does not disappear. It remains active beneath the surface, influencing behavior, mood, and perception in indirect ways. Denied truths often resurface as recurring patterns. The same conflicts reappear in different contexts. The same emotional reactions are triggered in similar situations. The same dissatisfaction persists without clear explanation. Yet because the underlying truth is not acknowledged, the pattern is experienced as external rather than internal. Escaping accountability is another expression of this circle. Accountability requires ownership of one's role in outcomes, both positive and negative. It requires acknowledging that actions have consequences, and that those consequences are not always external or accidental. When accountability is avoided, the sense of agency becomes distorted. Life begins to feel like something that happens to the individual, rather than something they participate in shaping. This distortion can be psychologically comforting in the short term. If outcomes are primarily attributed to external forces, then responsibility is reduced. There is less need for difficult change or self-examination. But over time, this reduction in responsibility weakens the sense of personal agency. If nothing is truly one's responsibility, then nothing is truly within one's power to change. This creates a paradoxical state. The more accountability is avoided, the less control one feels over their life. And the less control one feels, the more likely one is to continue avoiding accountability. The circle reinforces itself. Avoidance leads to helplessness, and helplessness justifies further avoidance. At a deeper level, all of these mechanisms, rationalization, denial, and avoidance of accountability, serve a single function: the avoidance of emotional discomfort associated with truth. Truth is not always pleasant. It can reveal limitations, mistakes, losses, unmet responsibilities, or uncomfortable aspects of the self. To face truth fully often requires emotional endurance. It requires the capacity to remain present with discomfort, without immediately escaping it. When that capacity is limited, the mind develops alternatives. It constructs narratives that soften impact, delay recognition, or redirect attention. These narratives are not always consciously dishonest. In many cases, they are sincerely believed. This is what makes self-deception so difficult to recognize. It does not feel like lying. It feels like interpretation, reasoning, or perspective. Yet beneath this interpretive layer, something more fundamental remains unchanged: reality itself. Regardless of how it is framed, avoided, or reinterpreted, reality continues to operate according to its own structure. Consequences unfold. Patterns repeat. Emotional residue accumulates. And eventually, what has been consistently avoided begins to demand recognition in more persistent ways. One of the most significant consequences of sustained self-deception is the gradual weakening of internal trust. When a person repeatedly avoids acknowledging what they already sense to be true, they begin to lose confidence in their own perception. Intuition becomes less reliable not because it is inaccurate, but because it is repeatedly overridden. The internal signal is present, but it is not followed. This creates a subtle fragmentation within consciousness. One part of the self continues to register reality as it is experienced directly, while another part constructs narratives that modify or soften that experience. Over time, The gap between these two modes of awareness can widen, creating internal confusion. A person may feel uncertain not because truth is inaccessible, but because it is continuously being reinterpreted at the moment it appears. In this condition, clarity becomes rare not because it is absent, but because it is interrupted. Moments of insight may arise, but they are quickly absorbed into familiar patterns of justification or avoidance. The discomfort that accompanies truth is redirected before it can fully stabilize into understanding. As a result, awareness remains fragmented rather than integrated. What makes this particularly significant is that the human psyche is not designed to sustain prolonged internal contradiction without cost. When behavior, perception, and awareness are consistently misaligned, tension accumulates. This tension may not always be consciously recognized, but it often manifests indirectly. It can appear as chronic dissatisfaction, emotional fatigue, restlessness, or a persistent sense that something is not quite right, even when external circumstances appear stable. In many cases, individuals attempt to resolve this discomfort by further adjusting narratives rather than addressing the underlying misalignment. This leads to increasingly sophisticated forms of self-justification. Explanations become more elaborate. Rationalizations become more refined. Denials become more subtle. Yet the underlying dissonance remains unchanged. The circle of deception is sustained by this cycle. Discomfort arises from truth. Truth is avoided through narrative adjustment. Narrative adjustment temporarily reduces discomfort, and reduced discomfort reinforces avoidance. Over time, this cycle becomes automatic. The mind becomes highly skilled at maintaining equilibrium through selective awareness rather than direct confrontation. And yet, despite its stability, this system is inherently fragile. It depends on continuous maintenance. It requires ongoing suppression of certain perceptions and reinforcement of alternative interpretations. When this maintenance weakens even slightly, underlying truths can re-emerge with force. This is often experienced as sudden clarity, emotional breakthrough, or moments where previously avoided realities become impossible to ignore. Such moments are often disruptive, not because they introduce new information, but because they remove the structures that have been holding awareness in place. What was always present beneath interpretation becomes visible again. And while this visibility can be painful, it is also stabilizing in the long term, because it reduces internal fragmentation. The deeper implication of this chapter is not that deception is rare or exceptional, but that it is common and often subtle. Most self-deception does not arise from malicious intent, but from a desire to preserve emotional stability in the face of discomfort. It is a coping mechanism that becomes maladaptive when it replaces engagement with reality rather than supporting temporary endurance. To move beyond the circle of deception requires a different relationship with discomfort. It requires the willingness to allow truth to be felt, even when it is inconvenient. It requires the recognition that emotional relief achieved through avoidance is temporary, while clarity achieved through acknowledgement is stabilizing. It requires the courage to see what is already partially known, without immediately reshaping it into something easier to accept. This does not mean embracing harshness or self-punishment. It does not mean rejecting compassion toward oneself. Rather, it means aligning perception more closely with reality, even when that alignment is uncomfortable in the short term. Because what is avoided does not disappear, it persists. And what persists without acknowledgement tends to shape life from beneath awareness. In the end, the circle of deception is sustained not by ignorance, but by reluctance. Reluctance to see clearly. Reluctance to feel fully. Reluctance to take responsibility for what is already understood at some level. And yet, within that reluctance, lies the possibility of change. Because what is recognized, even briefly, begins to lose its power to remain hidden. And so the central truth of this chapter becomes clear: hell deepens wherever truth is denied. Not because truth is punitive, but because denial creates distance from reality. And distance from reality is ultimately a distance from clarity, from agency, and from the possibility of genuine change. In that recognition, even if it arrives slowly, the circle of deception begins to loosen, not through force, but through the simple, difficult act of seeing what is already there. Chapter 9: The Circle of Spiritual Emptiness. There is a form of suffering that does not announce itself through pain, grief, or turmoil. It arrives more quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a gradual dimming of inner light. Life continues outwardly as before. The routines remain intact. Conversations still happen, responsibilities are still met, and days still pass in their familiar rhythm. Yet something essential is no longer present within the experience of living itself. It is not that life has ended in any physical sense, but that its meaning has begun to dissolve. This is the circle of spiritual emptiness, the deepest point in the descent, where human experience is no longer anchored in purpose, transcendence, or inner significance. It is a condition in which existence continues without resonance, motion continues without meaning, and awareness continues without direction. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. And precisely because it is quiet, it is often difficult to recognize until it has already taken root. Spiritual emptiness is not simply the absence of religious belief, nor is it limited to philosophical doubt. It is a more fundamental condition of disconnection from meaning itself. It is the experience of life as a sequence of events that do not ultimately point toward anything beyond themselves. In this state, even achievements lose their weight. Even relationships lose their depth. Even moments of joy lose their ability to echo beyond the moment in which they occur. At its core, human consciousness seems to be oriented toward meaning. Whether expressed through religion, philosophy, creativity, love, service, or personal aspiration, there is a natural tendency to seek something that transcends immediate experience. This does not necessarily require formal belief in metaphysical systems. It is more subtle than that. It is the instinct that life should matter beyond its immediate duration, that experiences should connect to something larger than themselves, that existence should have coherence beyond survival or repetition. When this orientation toward meaning is disrupted or lost, the structure of experience begins to change. Life becomes flatter. Events occur without depth of interpretation. Time passes, but does not accumulate into significance. Days become interchangeable, not because they are identical, but because they are no longer meaningfully differentiated in inner experience. Without a sense of direction or transcendence, the flow of time loses its narrative quality. One of the most visible expressions of spiritual emptiness in the modern world is cynicism. Cynicism often presents itself as intelligence, realism, or emotional maturity. It claims to see through illusions, to reject false hope, to avoid naive expectations. In small doses, skepticism can be healthy. It can protect against manipulation and unrealistic thinking. But when cynicism becomes a dominant lens through which all experience is interpreted, it begins to erode the possibility of meaning altogether. Cynicism operates by reducing significance. It reinterprets acts of kindness as self-interest, expressions of love as biological impulse, moments of beauty as chemical reactions, and aspirations as illusions. While these interpretations may contain partial truths, when they become totalizing, they strip experience of its depth. Everything becomes explainable in reductive terms, and what is fully explained in reduction often loses its capacity to inspire or elevate. Over time, this can lead to a subtle but profound emotional flattening. Nothing feels particularly sacred, not because nothing is valuable, but because the interpretive framework no longer allows for sacredness to be perceived. The world remains intact, but its symbolic depth is diminished. Beauty is still visible, but it no longer evokes reverence. Connection still occurs, but it no longer carries a sense of transcendence. In this condition, even positive experiences can feel hollow. Achievement no longer satisfies beyond its immediate recognition. Relationships may provide comfort, but lack existential grounding. Moments of joy arise but fade quickly, without leaving a lasting imprint. The issue is not the absence of experience, but the absence of meaning integrated into experience. Existential emptiness often emerges gradually, through a series of small disconnections rather than a single rupture. It can begin when goals are achieved, but fail to produce the anticipated sense of fulfillment. It can deepen when repeated cycles of desire and satisfaction begin to feel repetitive rather than meaningful. It can intensify when external validation loses its emotional impact, or when previously motivating ambitions begin to feel arbitrary. At some point in this progression, a shift occurs in how life is internally perceived. Activities continue, but they begin to feel less anchored. There is a sense of going through motions, without clear inner direction. Even rest can feel purposeless. Even stimulation can feel temporary. Even relationships can feel structurally insufficient to address the deeper sense that something essential is missing. This is where spiritual emptiness differs from ordinary dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction implies a specific lack that can be identified and addressed. Spiritual emptiness, by contrast, is less defined. It is not about lacking something particular, but about lacking the felt sense that anything ultimately matters in a deeper, enduring way. It is a loss of existential grounding, rather than a loss of specific content. In this state, time itself can begin to feel distorted. Without meaning to structure it, time becomes a sequence rather than a narrative. Days follow one another, but without inner continuity. Memory becomes less emotionally integrated. Future imagination becomes less compelling. The present moment becomes less inhabited. Life continues, but its internal coherence weakens. One of the most difficult aspects of spiritual emptiness is that it often resists simple solutions. External improvements, changes in circumstance, achievement of goals, acquisition of new experiences, do not reliably resolve it. This is because the condition is not primarily external. It is interpretive. It concerns the framework through which experience is understood, rather than the content of experience itself. As a result, individuals may find themselves attempting to fill this emptiness through increased activity, consumption, achievement, or stimulation. The assumption is often that more experience will produce more meaning. But without a corresponding shift in internal orientation, increased input does not necessarily produce increased depth. Instead, it can intensify the contrast between activity and meaninglessness, making the emptiness more noticeable. In some cases, this leads to a cycle of escalation. When meaning is not found in one source, attention shifts to another. When one goal fails to provide fulfillment, a new goal is introduced. When one experience loses its impact, another is sought. Yet the underlying sense of emptiness remains unchanged, because the structure of seeking itself has not been addressed. At a deeper level, spiritual emptiness is closely tied to the loss of transcendence. Transcendence does not necessarily refer to religious belief, though it can include it. It refers more broadly to the sense that life is connected to something beyond immediate, isolated experience. This could be meaning, purpose, love, truth, creativity, or a sense of participation in something larger than the individual self. When transcendence is present, even ordinary experiences can carry depth. A simple moment can feel meaningful because it is connected to a larger narrative of existence. When transcendence is absent, even extraordinary experiences can feel hollow because they remain confined within themselves. They do not connect to anything beyond their immediate occurrence. The loss of transcendence often leads to a narrowing of perception. Attention becomes focused on immediate utility, immediate gratification, or immediate relevance. What cannot be measured, optimized, or immediately justified may begin to feel less real. Over time, this can reduce the perceived significance of experiences that do not serve a clear practical function. Yet human beings are not structured solely around utility. There is a dimension of consciousness that seeks meaning beyond function, coherence beyond efficiency, and significance beyond immediate benefit. When this dimension is neglected, a subtle form of internal disorientation can emerge. Life continues, but without a felt sense of direction. Inner spiritual collapse, as a culmination of this process, is not necessarily dramatic. It is often experienced as quiet resignation. A sense that nothing ultimately matters in a way that feels deeply compelling. Not necessarily despair, but a flattening of existential intensity. The highs and lows of experience become less pronounced, not because suffering has disappeared, but because meaning has receded. This condition can coexist with external success, social stability, and functional daily life. A person can appear fully engaged with the world, while internally feeling detached from its significance. This disjunction between outer functioning and inner meaning is one of the most subtle and challenging aspects of modern spiritual emptiness. It is important to note that this condition is not permanent or absolute. It is not a final state of being, but a dynamic condition shaped by perception, attention, and orientation. The human capacity for meaning is not destroyed, it is obscured. It is not absent, it is unaccessed. And what is unaccessed can, under different conditions, be re-engaged. Moments of meaning often reappear unexpectedly. They may arise in contact with nature, in deep conversation, in creative expression, in acts of compassion, or in moments of silence where attention is no longer fragmented. In such moments, the sense of emptiness can briefly lift, revealing that meaning is not entirely gone, but has simply not been sustained. These moments suggest an important distinction. Meaning is not only something that is found externally, but something that is also cultivated internally. It is not solely dependent on circumstances, but also on the depth of attention brought to those circumstances. When attention is shallow, meaning struggles to form. When attention is deep, even simple experiences can become significant. The circle of spiritual emptiness persists when this depth of attention is lost or rarely accessed. When life is lived primarily at the surface of experience, meaning has little space to emerge. But when attention deepens, even briefly, a different quality of experience becomes possible. One in which life is not only observed, but felt as meaningful participation in something larger than isolated moments. The central danger of spiritual emptiness is not suffering in the traditional sense, but the erosion of significance. Suffering, while painful, still confirms that something matters. Emptiness, by contrast, suggests that nothing does. And in that suggestion lies a deeper form of disorientation than pain alone can produce. To move beyond this circle is not to force meaning artificially, nor to impose belief where none exists. It is to reopen the possibility of depth. It is to allow attention to become more sustained, more receptive, more capable of remaining with experience long enough for meaning to emerge naturally, rather than being immediately dismissed or overridden. It is also to reconsider the assumption that meaning must always be externally given. Meaning may arise not only from outcomes or achievements, but from the quality of presence brought to lived experience. From the capacity to be fully engaged with what is, rather than constantly searching for what might fill a perceived absence. In this sense, spiritual emptiness is not only a loss but also a signal. It signals that something in the relationship with life has become too shallow, too fragmented, or too disconnected from depth. It points toward the need not for more stimulation but for more presence. Not for more input, but for more integration. And within that recognition lies the first quiet step out of the circle, the realization that emptiness is not the final truth of existence, but a condition that arises when meaning is no longer being accessed. It is not the end of significance, but the experience of its absence in perception. And in that distinction, even if only faintly perceived, the possibility of return begins to emerge. Chapter 10 The Ascent begins. There comes a moment in every long descent when something subtle changes. It is not a dramatic escape, nor an immediate transformation, nor a sudden liberation from all that has been carried. Instead, it is quieter than that. It is the moment when the weight of the descent becomes fully visible, not only as something endured, but as something understood. And in that understanding, a different possibility begins to emerge, not as certainty but as direction. The ascent does not begin with elevation. It begins with recognition. It begins when a person stops interpreting their condition as normal without question, and starts seeing it clearly for what it is. The modern inferno described in the previous chapters is not always made of overt suffering. It is made of distraction, comparison, emptiness, deception, numbness, isolation and fragmentation. It is made of conditions that feel ordinary, precisely because they are widespread. And this is what makes them so powerful. They are not always recognized as something from which one must escape. But recognition changes everything. The moment a person sees their condition clearly, even briefly, something inside them begins to shift. Not necessarily their external circumstances, not immediately their habits, and not instantly their emotional state, but their orientation. Orientation is the beginning of movement. Before a person can ascend, they must first know they are no longer aligned with where they truly wish to be. And this awareness is not punishment. It is the beginning of awakening. Awakening is not a single event. It is a gradual reawakening of perception itself. It is the slow return of sensitivity, after years of overstimulation, avoidance, numbness and fragmentation. It is not the creation of something new, but the uncovering of something that was always present but partially obscured. Underneath distraction there is still attention. Underneath numbness there is still feeling. Underneath deception there is still truth. Underneath emptiness, there is still meaning waiting to be re-entered. This is why the ascent does not require becoming someone else. It requires returning to what has been forgotten. The first step in this return is radical honesty. Not the performative honesty that is used to appear self-aware, nor the selective honesty that reveals only what is comfortable, but the kind of honesty that allows reality to be seen without immediate distortion. Radical honesty does not mean harshness toward oneself. It means refusal to abandon truth in exchange for comfort. It means allowing what is real to remain real, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it disrupts familiar narratives. Radical honesty begins in small moments. It begins when a person notices avoidance, and does not immediately justify it. It begins when a pattern is recognized, and not immediately excused. It begins when emotional states are acknowledged, instead of overridden. It begins when life is no longer automatically filtered through rationalization, distraction, or denial. At first, this level of honesty can feel destabilizing. This is because many people have built their internal stability not on truth, but on avoidance of truth. When avoidance is removed, even partially, the structures built upon it begin to feel uncertain. But this uncertainty is not collapse. It is exposure. And exposure is the beginning of clarity. The modern world rarely encourages this kind of honesty because it is uncomfortable. It interrupts narratives of constant positivity, productivity, performance, and control. It reveals complexity where simplicity is preferred. It introduces depth where surface-level functioning is often rewarded. But without honesty, no real transformation is possible. Because transformation cannot occur in relation to illusion. It can only occur in relation to reality. Alongside honesty, the ascent requires the return of silence. Silence in this context is not merely the absence of sound, but the restoration of inner space. It is the reintroduction of moments in which the mind is not constantly occupied by input, stimulation, or reaction. Silence is where perception begins to reorganize itself. It is where fragmented experience starts to settle. It is where what has been avoided can finally surface without immediate interruption. In silence, something often becomes visible that is otherwise hidden, the continuity of inner life. Without constant distraction, thoughts begin to connect more naturally. Emotions begin to reveal their underlying patterns. Memory begins to regain coherence. Silence does not add anything new, it removes interference. And in that removal, what was always present becomes more accessible. At first, silence can feel uncomfortable for those accustomed to constant stimulation. It may bring restlessness, anxiety, or emotional agitation. This is not a sign that silence is harmful. It is a sign that the mind is no longer being numbed by constant input. What was previously suppressed begins to surface. And what surfaces, though uncomfortable, is part of what makes healing possible. Reflection grows naturally out of silence. Reflection is the ability to remain with experience long enough to understand it. It is not reaction. It is not escape. It is not judgment. It is sustained awareness. In reflection, a person begins to see patterns rather than isolated events. They begin to understand not only what is happening, but how it is happening, and how their own participation shapes their experience. Without reflection, life is experienced as a series of disconnected moments. With reflection, life begins to form a narrative. Not a fixed story, but a coherent unfolding that can be understood and engaged with more consciously. Reflection restores continuity to experience. It allows a person to see themselves not as a collection of reactions, but as an ongoing process of becoming. Truth-telling follows naturally from reflection. Once patterns are seen clearly, they can no longer be unseen. At that point, the question is no longer whether something is true, but whether one is willing to acknowledge what is already known. Truth-telling is not always about communicating with others, often it begins internally. It is the willingness to admit to oneself what has been previously avoided. This internal truth-telling is one of the most difficult aspects of the ascent, because it requires letting go of internal narratives that have provided comfort, even if they are not accurate. It requires acknowledging responsibility where it exists, recognizing patterns that are uncomfortable, and allowing emotional realities to be felt without immediate reinterpretation. But in doing so, it restores integrity between perception and reality. As honesty, silence, reflection, and truth-telling begin to re-establish themselves, something else begins to emerge: meaning. not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. Meaning is not something imposed onto life from the outside. It arises when life is engaged with fully and truthfully. It is the felt sense that experience is coherent, significant, and connected to something beyond immediate fragmentation. Meaning does not always appear as certainty. It often appears as direction, a sense of orientation rather than conclusion, a sense that one is no longer merely drifting through experience, but participating in it with increasing awareness. This sense of direction is fragile at first, easily disrupted by old patterns of distraction or avoidance, but it grows stronger through repetition and attention. Alongside meaning, meaningful relationships begin to regain importance. In the descent, relationships are often fragmented by distraction, performance, comparison, or emotional distance. In the ascent, relationships begin to be re-evaluated not by quantity or convenience, but by depth. The quality of presence becomes more important than frequency of contact. The ability to be emotionally real becomes more important than maintaining appearances. Meaningful relationships are not necessarily many, but they are real. They are relationships in which presence is mutual, where honesty is possible, where vulnerability is not entirely suppressed, and where connection is not reduced to performance. These relationships become anchors in the process of ascent, because they provide spaces in which truth can be shared without distortion. Faith and spiritual awakening in this context do not necessarily refer to formal religious structures, though they may include them. They refer more broadly to the reawakening of trust in meaning itself. Faith here is not blind belief. It is the willingness to remain open to the possibility that life is not empty, even when emptiness has been deeply felt. It is the recognition that meaning may not always be immediately visible, but that it can re-emerge when attention is restored. Spiritual awakening in its simplest form is the reorientation of perception from fragmentation to wholeness. It is the shift from seeing life as a series of disconnected events to experiencing it as a coherent unfolding. It is not an escape from reality, but a deeper entry into it. It is not a rejection of modern life, but a re-engagement with it from a more conscious position. What makes this awakening significant is that it does not require perfection. It does not require the complete elimination of distraction, deception, numbness, or emptiness. It requires only recognition and continued return. Return to honesty when avoidance arises. Return to silence when noise dominates. Return to reflection when reaction takes over. Return to meaning when emptiness reappears. The ascent is not linear. It does not move steadily upward without interruption. It includes setbacks, repetitions, and moments of forgetting. But what distinguishes ascent from descent is not the absence of struggle, it is the direction of awareness. In descent, awareness moves further away from truth. In ascent, awareness repeatedly returns to it, even after deviation. This is why the most important realization of this chapter is simple but profound. Every descent contains the possibility of ascent. Nothing in the structure of modern suffering is absolute. No pattern is irreversible. No condition is final. What has been built through avoidance can be unbuilt through awareness. What has been obscured can be revealed again. What has been fragmented can begin to integrate. The ascent begins not with escape from life, but with a different way of being within it. A way that is more honest, more present, more reflective, and more open to meaning. And while the path is not easy, it is already available within the very conditions that created the descent. Because even in the deepest darkness, the capacity to see has not been destroyed. It has only been waiting to be turned back toward the light. Conclusion: emerging from the Inferno. There is a moment in every long journey through darkness when the nature of the darkness itself begins to change. Not because it disappears, and not because it suddenly becomes less real, but because it is no longer experienced in the same way. What once felt total begins to feel understood. What once felt endless begins to feel contained. And what once felt like a destination begins to feel like a passage. This shift is subtle, but it is decisive. It marks the difference between being lost within an experience and beginning to see it from within a wider frame of awareness. In the depths of modern Inferno, the circles of distraction, comparison, consumption, disconnection, numbness, isolation, deception, and emptiness, it often feels as though these conditions define reality itself. They appear not as temporary distortions, but as the structure of life. Yet even in their most overwhelming form, they are not the final shape of existence. They are states within it, not its totality. The danger of any inferno, whether ancient or modern, is not only the suffering it contains, but the illusion that there is nothing beyond it. When a person is immersed in pain, fragmentation, or emptiness for long enough, it can begin to feel as though this condition is permanent. The mind adjusts its expectations downward. Hope narrows. Possibility contracts. And slowly, without dramatic collapse, the idea of transformation begins to feel less like a real option and more like a distant abstraction. This is where the significance of the journey becomes most important. To name the inferno is already to step outside of it, even if only slightly. To recognize its patterns is to create a point of awareness that is no longer fully absorbed within them. Awareness by its nature introduces distance. And distance, even in the smallest measure, creates the possibility of movement. Dante's journey through the Inferno was never meant to end in hell. It was structured as a descent, yes, but not as a final residence. The descent was a passage through distortion, through suffering, through disorientation, but it was always oriented toward emergence. The deeper truth of that journey is not the horror of the descent, but the inevitability of ascent that follows it. Hell, in that sense, is not a destination. It is a stage of understanding. The same principle applies to the modern inferno described in this book. The circles of contemporary life are not fixed states of being, but patterns of experience that arise from particular ways of relating to attention, identity, emotion, truth, and meaning. They persist not because they are absolute, but because they are reinforced. And what is reinforced can also be interrupted. To emerge from such patterns is not to deny their reality. It is not to pretend they do not exist, or to dismiss their impact. It is to see them clearly enough that they no longer define the totality of experience. Clarity does not erase darkness. It places it within a larger field of understanding. And within that larger field, movement becomes possible again. One of the most important realizations that emerges at the end of this journey is that modern hell is not primarily composed of extraordinary suffering. It is composed of ordinary conditions that have lost their balance. Overstimulation that replaces stillness. Comparison that replaces identity. Consumption that replaces fulfillment. Disconnection that replaces presence. Numbness that replaces feeling. Isolation that replaces intimacy. Deception that replaces truth. Emptiness that replaces meaning. None of these conditions is inherently absolute. Each one exists on a spectrum. Each one becomes destructive not by its mere presence, but by its dominance. When distraction becomes constant, stillness disappears. When comparison becomes continuous, identity erodes. When consumption becomes compulsive, fulfillment vanishes. When disconnection becomes habitual, presence weakens. When avoidance becomes automatic, truth fades. When emptiness becomes interpretive, meaning collapses. And yet, in each case, the possibility of reversal remains embedded within the structure itself. Stillness is always available beneath distraction. Identity can re-emerge beneath comparison. Fulfillment can return beneath consumption. Presence can be restored beneath disconnection. Truth can re-enter beneath avoidance. Meaning can reawaken beneath emptiness. Nothing essential is destroyed, it is obscured. This is why the Inferno is not a final destination. It is a revelation of what happens when human consciousness becomes disconnected from its own depth. It shows what life becomes when attention is fragmented, when emotion is suppressed, when truth is avoided, and when meaning is no longer actively cultivated. But precisely because it reveals these conditions, it also implicitly points toward their opposite. The journey through darkness is therefore not only about recognition of suffering, but about recognition of structure. It reveals how easily the human mind can become absorbed in patterns that feel inevitable, but are actually contingent. It shows how habits of perception, once formed, begin to shape reality from within. And it demonstrates that what feels like external fate is often the result of internal orientation. To understand this is to begin the process of liberation, not in a dramatic sense, but in a foundational one. Liberation begins when a person realizes that they are participating in their experience, not merely receiving it. That awareness itself plays a role in shaping perception. That attention is not passive, but active. That what is repeatedly focused on becomes dominant, and what is consistently ignored becomes distant. From this perspective, the Inferno is not only something that happens to people, it is also something that is sustained through patterns of engagement. And if it is sustained, it can also be altered. This does not mean that transformation is easy or immediate. It does not mean that the conditions described in this book can be resolved by simple intention. It means that they are not fixed in place beyond influence. Emerging from the Inferno, then, is not a single act, but a gradual reorientation. It begins with recognition, deepens through honesty, stabilizes through reflection, and expands through sustained engagement with truth and meaning. It is a process of returning attention to what has been neglected, of reintroducing depth where surface has dominated, and of restoring presence where fragmentation has taken hold. In this sense, the conclusion of this journey is not an ending but a threshold. It is the point at which understanding begins to translate into lived change. It is where insight stops being conceptual and starts becoming experiential. And it is where the possibility of a different way of being is no longer theoretical, but quietly real. What remains essential throughout this transition is the understanding that darkness itself is not meaningless. It is instructive. It reveals what happens when certain aspects of human experience are neglected or distorted. It shows the cost of disconnection from attention, emotion, truth, and meaning. And in showing this, it creates the conditions for their recovery. Without recognition of darkness, there is no awareness of light. Not because light depends on darkness for existence, but because perception depends on contrast to become conscious of direction. A person who has never experienced fragmentation cannot fully appreciate coherence. A person who has never experienced numbness cannot fully recognize aliveness. A person who has never experienced emptiness cannot fully understand meaning. This is why the descent matters. It is not a punishment. It is a form of unveiling. It strips away illusions that prevent deeper awareness. It exposes patterns that operate beneath conscious recognition. And in doing so, it creates the possibility of a more intentional relationship with life. To confront the Inferno, therefore, is not to remain within it. It is to see it clearly enough that its influence begins to loosen. It is to bring awareness into spaces that were previously automatic. It is to interrupt patterns that were previously unquestioned. And it is to begin, however gently, to choose differently. The journey home does not require perfection. It does not require the complete elimination of struggle, distraction, or confusion. It requires orientation. A direction of awareness that increasingly favors truth over avoidance, presence over fragmentation, depth over surface, and meaning over emptiness. It is sustained not by certainty but by return. Return is perhaps the most important movement in the entire arc of this journey. Because no one exits the inferno in a single step. There are moments of clarity, followed by moments of forgetting. There are periods of insight, followed by repetition of old patterns. There are openings followed by closures. But each return matters. Each return re-establishes direction. Each return strengthens awareness of possibility. Over time, these returns begin to accumulate. And what accumulates is not perfection, but orientation. A gradual shift in the center of gravity of consciousness. A movement from unconscious participation in patterns toward conscious engagement with them. A transition from being carried by the inferno to beginning to see it as something that can be navigated. And within that shift, something profound becomes visible. The inferno was never the whole story. It was only one chapter in a much larger unfolding. The final message of this journey is therefore simple, but not simplistic. It is a reminder that carries weight, precisely because it has been lived through experience rather than merely imagined. To recognize darkness is the first step toward light. To confront the inferno is to begin the journey home. And the home that is being spoken of here is not a place in the external world. It is a way of being in which attention is no longer fragmented beyond recognition, in which emotion is no longer persistently avoided, in which truth is no longer systematically distorted, and in which meaning is no longer entirely obscured. It is not a perfect state. It is a more honest one, a more present one, a more awake one. And once it is even partially remembered, it cannot be fully forgotten. Because the journey through the inferno does not end in darkness. It ends in light. Thank you for reading this book. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to leave us a review. TM Light. Disclaimer. This book was created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. While every effort was made to ensure the accuracy and relevance of the content, readers should note that this cannot be considered professional advice. Readers are encouraged to apply their own judgment and consult experts where needed.